His Excellency Master Ref Jackson. As you may not be surprised to learn, I really like pie. I prepared 3 separate entries for this competition this weekend. I painted a recreation of an early 16th century miniature. I did a statistical analysis of women's participation in guilds in York, England between 1272 and 1377. And the entry that I'm presenting today is a recreation of a pie from Form of Curie, which is a late 14th century culinary text. So the pie that I am presenting today, I have a couple of helpers, if you don't know. There's a lot of running. So the pie that I am presenting is called Cristards of Flush. It has an heirloom wheat and lard crust. It has 3 different types of birds in it, and the filling is augmented with imported spices and fruits. I wanted to start by talking both about the source material that I worked from and by extension the cultural context of this piece. So this is a pie that is literally fit to set before a king. The source recipe that I worked from is in Form of Curie. It was first compiled around 1390. We do not have an extant copy of it from that early. So I worked from transcriptions of the oldest copies that we have, which date to the very early 15th century. However, we have enough provenance to feel confident that the Form of Curie as it comes to us is at least broadly similar to as it was originally set down. That work was written by the master cooks of Richard II, so it was prepared for a royal kitchen, and it was written to be, it occupies an interesting niche, so depending on how familiar you are with historical cooking, medieval culinary manuscripts do not match our modern idea of a cookbook. So I cannot go to the shelf and pull off Form of Curie and cook from it exactly as it is written, the way I could with my copy of James Stephen. Medieval culinary manuscripts occupied a different social function. And I think in many ways they were more about recording what was happening in a particular kitchen than educating others. That said, the preface of Form of Curie does say that its purpose is to record how to make certain types of foods. So it does seem to give us the sense that it was meant to be instructional, at least in some form. So what that means is that there's more ambiguity in a historical recipe than in a modern recipe. And part of what I have tried to tease out in this process of recreating this pie is filling in those gaps. So if you are one of my judges, if you would like to turn to tab 3, has the source recipe that I worked from both in Middle English and in Modern English. If you don't mind, would you give me the folder? I'm just going to read it in Modern English so that you have a sense of what we're working from. Thank you so much. So this is, again, in Modern English. My Middle English pronunciation is not quite up to the task. Cristards of flesh. Take pigeons, chickens, and small birds. Smite them in gobbets. And seethe them all fair in good broth, and in grease with verjus. Do thereto saffron and powder fort. Make a crust in a trap, and pinch it, and couch the flesh therein. And cast therein currants, powder deuce, and salt. Break eggs, and wring them through a cloth, and swing the juice of the stew therewith, and hold it upon the flesh. Cover it, and bake it well, and serve it forth. So again, you can see there's ambiguity. We have to do some interpretive dancing. This recipe, coming from that high status context, significantly influenced my recreation choices. Because I knew this was meant for a royal audience, this food was meant for a royal audience, everything downstream of knowing that was influenced by that. That was how I made my decisions of what type of ingredients should I use. So I have a lot of passion. So one thing that I'm incredibly passionate about is the intersection of food and social class. So when we talk about period food, that is sloppy. Period food is too broad of a category. When we speak of period food, we need to speak in terms of when, where, and whom. So I'm very fascinated by that, specifically within England, within a pretty narrow time range, how did who you were socially influence what you eat? And how did you perform who you were socially influence what you eat? Because the recipe that I was working from, as I said, was rather ambiguous, I needed to flesh out what type of ingredients to use. I've found that there's a significant body of archaeological work now available for English food. So I was able to look at archaeological analyses of what have we found where, and how can we tie that to social class. So I was able to look at archaeological records from high status contexts of what types of foods were available. And that really helped me determine what type of wheat did I use for the crust, what type of birds did I use for the filling, how do these spices play into that. If you could you please help me with some? We have two lovely helpers here. So as we are within this noble context, we are civilized people, and we wash our hands before we eat. So Her Excellency will be coming with some rose water scented, with some rose water to rinse your hands so that you can be clean before you dine. Could you help me with that? And then I will be bringing in the pie samples so that you can nibble on while I talk a little bit more about what's in it. So if you've talked to me, I was going to say if you were here last year, but I amended that. If you've talked to me at any point in the last year and a half, you have probably heard me get really excited about anything. But you've probably heard me get super excited about my research into pie crusts. So last year I did this massive comparative project where I tried to suss out what was the most common way that a high medieval, high status English chef would have made pie crust. What came out of that research was a hot water crust made with lard. So that's what I've used to recreate this today. I did a recipe analysis of all of the pie recipes within the form of Curie, and actually within the 14th century English corpus as a whole. There are not pie crust recipes as such within that. So that is all speculative. What I did find, so this recipe, this pie specifically is baked in a trap. Do you mind if I hold the pie for a second? So if we read in the recipe, this specifies that's baked in a trap. So a trap is a dish. This one is a replica pie dish that was made for me. So this is a very common form for pie dishes between about 1300 and 1500. You'll notice that it's much shallower than a modern day. Much shallower than a modern day pie dish. So one of the things that came out of my analysis was I had wanted there to be a difference between what types of pies or what types of crusts are in a dish versus raised as a coffin. And what I found from looking at the recipes and testing this recipe many different ways. So I've cooked this pie many times in the last year. And one of the things that I tested was doing it in a container versus as a coffin. And what I found is that recipes like this that have a lot of liquid do not work in coffins. I had originally approached this thinking that there was probably a crust difference between what went in a coffin and what went in a trap. I feel like I no longer have good evidence to support them. So now I would say that I think that the primary difference is in the filling. One of the great frustrations of my pie crust research last year was looking for the right flour. So if you've ever done a research project where you have run up against the research wall, where you know how they did it, but for love or for money, you cannot get the things they used to do it. That was what I hit last year. So the pie that you are eating today, the crust contains, I was very lucky this year and have discovered. So the type of flour that would have been used in England at this time period, they were growing what's called landrace wheat. So this is many types of wheat grown together. They would all ripen at slightly different times. It's very, very different from when you are traveling to an event in your wagon and you look out and you see this endless uniform field of wheat. It's not what a field of wheat would have looked like. There would have been short stalks and tall stalks. Some would have been ripe before others. There are also two different distinct species of wheat within this. T. turgidum, which is called rivet wheat, that had very tall stalks. And that was used for roof thatching. So part of why it was more common then was it was a multi-purpose crop. There's also bread wheat, so T. estimum, which is what we're more familiar with. So this, from archaeological evidence, we have really good support for the idea that those two wheats were grown together. Wheat flour for high status context. So wheat was more difficult to grow. So wheat flour is another way that this pie fits into that higher status context. We also know from archaeological and other documentary evidence that flour used in high status context was typically sifted. So this has been sifted, that was how they yielded white flour. And that white flour is extraordinarily different from modern white flour. So I wanted to show you some just comparisons of different types of